Hello and welcome everyone to this episode, and in this episode we want to discuss about identifiers. So what is exactly an identifier? You know that we created some variables, and those variables, they had to have a name. So these names are called identifiers. So the name for a variable is called an identifier, and also later on when we create functions, you will see that we will use identifiers for the name of functions as well. So basically, identifiers are names that we can define in C programming language, and these names, they have to follow some rules. We can't just use anything for a name. They have a little bit of rules and regulations that we have to follow. So what is the rules and regulations? First, let me write the title for you in here, identifiers. And so for identifiers, we can use letters. So letters of English language, letters plus digits of English language, 1, 2, 3, 4, including 0 from 1 to 9, and then 0 included as well. And then we can also use underscore. So an identifier can be a composition of letters and digits and underscore, and when we combine them, we can create an identifier. For example, here, num1 is a combination of letters and digits. And basically for this num1, I can create another variable name such as num with underscore and then 1, or num uppercase here and then 1, and as such we can create different types of names. So you have to remember that whenever you want to name a variable or a function, the name should also indicate some meaning. For example, in here we have used num, that means it's a number. And as such, the names should be meaningful. We can have X and Y in here, or we can have A and B. This is also correct and it will work, but the X or Y or A and B does not represent the meaning of this variable and what it is used for. So it's better to use an identifier which represents the meaning of that variable. So num1 or num1 is a good example that we can use for our identifiers. And also you have to remember that we cannot start identifiers by numbers. So you cannot have one num. This first letter of an identifier cannot be a digit or a number. So this is not allowed, you cannot have it, but you can start with letters or you can start with underscore, that is also possible. Another thing that you have to remember is that identifiers are case sensitive. That means that num is not equal to num. So because of the differences of cases in here, these two identifiers are not the same for each other. And later on we will have some examples on my computer, and you will see that the compiler will treat this identifier differently from these identifiers. So these two identifiers are basically totally different identifiers, and if you are using an identifier, it has to match exactly the same. So if you used num1 in here, you cannot use and make this num an uppercase n in here. That will give you an error because this will represent another identifier, and it will represent an identifier which is different from the one in here. And that's it. Let's go and head to my computer and see a few examples. So here we are on my laptop, and now we will see a few examples on identifiers. We said that identifiers are valid when they're a composition of letters and digits and underscore. But we can never start an identifier with a number. So let's try out that. So let's have this one instead of a instead of the end of the identifier, we will put it here in the beginning, and we will change the other ones as well so we don't get errors about those. And that's it. We have changed the name of this identifier, and we have given a number at the first part of this identifier, which is basically not allowed. If we try to compile and run, we will get an error. You can see that invalid suffix num on integer constant. So we cannot have an identifier start with a number. It should always be at the end of the identifier, or it could be in the middle of identifier between any of these letters, but it can never be in the start of an identifier. So let's go and fix this. And secondly, we said that identifiers are case sensitive. So even if you change the case of just one of these letters, these two identifiers will represent a different identifier. So even if I bring a change in here and make this as a capital N, now the rest of the identifiers will not be recognized. Let's go and execute. And now you can see that the compiler does not recognize this identifier because it's different from this one, and the compiler is telling us that num1 is not declared because this is a different identifier and this is a different identifier. So if we bring any changes in the name while declaring an identifier, while declaring a variable, we have to bring that change to the whole program. So now if I bring that change to all of these other instances of use of that identifier, then everything will be okay. Let's go and run. And now everything is working fine. And that's it for this episode. See you in the coming episodes.